when he has just left his first post after his degree at Tübingen as a seminarian. And of course, his roommates there in Tübingen were both Hölderlin and Schelling. Hegel writes a poem to his friend Hölderlin. This is in 1796. He's yet to establish an academic career, but he's beginning his career, so quote unquote, by writing a poem. And the poem, interestingly, is called Eleusis, and it is about the Eleusinian mysteries. And effectively, the poem is about the ineffability at the heart of those mysteries. And Agamben picks this poem up, and this young Hegel's gesture to his friend in his first book, Agamben's first book on language. And Agamben says that Hegel himself here is acting as a kind of guardian to the Eleusinian silence. Here is one line from that poem. And so you do not live on their lips. Their life honored you. And your life still lives in their acts. You do not live on their lips. You live in their action. I suggest right at the beginning of Hegelian thought is not philosophy, at least not in the technical sense, but the act of living and creating, which is a kind of ritualized protection of negativity, of negation. And that if we keep this in mind, the mature Hegel, the old Hegel, however systematized he becomes, is always in his own loop, always in his circularity, always in his contradictory but complementary cogenitive relationship with himself. And that if we think of Hegel that way, I think he should belong to the pantheon of great apophatic thinkers. Thank you.
So, the pantheon of great apophatic thinkers. Let's see, I'm sure that we have some contestation, what makes you a member and makes you enter it or leave it, and whether membership is always a good thing in the pantheon of apophatic thinkers. So who would like to begin the question period? We have about 5 minutes or so. So, William?
Yeah, I don't want to resist bringing Hegel into the pantheon. I like this image, and it's exactly what I would like to do. I didn't know how to do it, and I think Andrew has explained perfectly lucidly how this can be done. And I felt compelled, really, somewhat regretfully, to have to leave him out, even though I can see how central he is to the whole question. But this gives, I think, really the technical way of explaining how he does further exactly the kinds of discourses of apophaticism that can be found before and after and all around Hegel. This is exactly in the spirit of what I want to do, and wasn't quite ready to. Andrew's books came out, I should mention, just as my book. There's a reference, I believe, to Hegel and the Art of Negation that was put in the final stage of checking the proofs. I couldn't really absorb what Andrew had to offer, but I realized its pertinence at the last minute. There's more on Auden's O in another context. So, this, to my mind, is really a perfect extension in the spirit of my attempt to read Hegel apophatically. Thank you.
If I may, I did put my name on the invisible list of questions. Just as a little challenge to seeing whether the art of negation is a good guiding principle to Hegel's philosophy, I always think I agree with the critique of some form of negative theology as one finds the night in which all the cows are black, and the lack of distinction and differentiation. I did not that much agree to saying that the negation of the negation is the only driving force of Hegelian philosophy, and I cannot help but continue the discussion we had over lunch. It seems to me that one of the counter concepts to negation and negativity is not so much absolute knowing and absolute knowledge writ capitalized, but rather the concept of reconciliation. If we look not only the writings you cited, but those focusing on objective spirit and the other two parts of absolute spirit you left out, it seems that this is where reconciliation plays a huge role. Even when he talks about tarrying with the negative, the next sentence then is then that the reconciled whole can be thought in this way. And I wonder if you see this as a counter project or just a right Hegelian invention, this project of reconciliation, or whether you think it's a necessary complement to any form of double negativity that you so beautifully outlined.
Yeah, let me just qualify that double negativity is just one aspect of the kind of looping circularity that he talks about. But I think we can just keep negation as the always operating term that allows both sides to come into being in the first instance, whether it's unsayable or sayable, or whether it's being or non-being, or whatever pairs are. This acts as the possibility, maybe Agamben's term of the potentiality. It's always operating. That's just by way of preface. I think reconciliation falls into the same term as the absolute. I think reconciliation really depends on how you choose to read something like the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology. And there, of course, there's a way of saying that reconciliation is a kind of ultimate goal in the system. But when I read the master-slave dialectic, I do not see, at least at that Jena period of Hegel, that reconciliation somehow moves beyond that negating motive element. That reconciliation requires the kind of constant contestation that negation continually brings. And others have read this right through to the very end of Hegel. So even in his final book, Philosophy of Right, you get someone like Frank Ruda now talking about how the rabble figures in as that kind of moment where the reconciliation of particularly is no longer possible yet, or no longer whole or total in that sense. So I think reconciliation is just another one of those terms that I would say, along with Nancy, is got the unruah of negation constantly working with it.
And you would see it on a par with the concept of negation and negativity, or negativity somehow working at the basis of reconciliation even?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Negativity working at the basis of basis. You've got to be careful with that term. This isn't a ground. It's not a ground. It's kind of negation. That ground is constantly negating itself. And therein lies the logical fallacy, but also the generative moment. So it's a basis only insofar as it can constantly undermine and regenerate itself.
Okay, we have the next question by Professor White.
And you mentioned this, the moving force or moving power of the negation. But we know that when we read Hegel, there are two ways to read it. One is read it from young Hegel, and this moving force coming from, we say this activity of life of the Geist itself. Another one may be implication coming from the old Hegel, and this moving force comes from the system itself. And also, this is also related to Hegel's, let's say, what would you say, the truth said in a whole, or in a system. Okay. And I guess when we read William's book, you mentioned Colloqium's the reading of Hegel. I guess Colloqium's interpretation of Hegel are more closely to the first or young Hegelian reading of it. And
So Reagan's is about the mature Hegel.
right, mature Hegel.
So you're right. Depends where you want to start.
Right, and also the Marx read of Hegel, probably from the system. Yeah, so that's how Marxist system works. And how do you see this tension of within the system of Hegel's system himself when you deal with this negation? Because if we see the first perspective, and the negation will be some kind of the wide or some kind of very even dangerous, or even the Hegel somewhere call it the force of evil. But when we see from the mature Hegel or old Hegel, and then this negation just play a role like a medium, like a stage toward to the realization of this teleological whole.
I think the best way to answer this, as far as I'm concerned, is the science of logic, which is smack in the middle. I think chronologically it is perfectly in the middle to all his writings. It's not the early, it's not the late Hegel. It's right in the middle. It's the one that's least engaged with. It's the one that's most difficult. Far and away, it's most difficult. If we read that text and we put that centrally, what I suggest happens, which happens with all great philosophers, is their own philosophy outdoes them. It negates them. I would say this happens from Plato right through to Derrida. And Hegel becomes his own implosion. So that the young Hegel and the old Hegel are in this kind of loop with each other. And then the best way to read Hegel is to outdo Hegel on Hegel's terms. And this is how I think Derrida reads Hegel all the time. As someone who is outdoing himself, wittingly and unwittingly at the same time. So that the way to engage with Hegel is to make sure you go beyond Hegel. And I think William is picking up on this in his way. I think he sees that you have to outdo Hegel in Hegel's own terms. And you can do that, I suggest, by Wissenschaft der Logik. That's the best text.
Thank you very much. So these are perfect last words, so we have to move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker will join us now from the University of Macau, Nahum Brown, who did his PhD at Guelph University, and also a specialist about Hegel, but not only Hegel, but potentiality more generally. Today, Nahum will speak about totality and apophasis, expanding rationality with Hegel.
Okay, I'll read a paper for a few minutes, and I think I may cover some of similar ground as Andrew just did, but that's maybe productive in a way. Totality and apophasis, expanding rationality with Hegel. William Frank's philosophy of the unsayable contains a sustained and detailed analysis of Hegel. This analysis appears primarily in chapter 2 in The Hollow of Pan's Pipe, with the most sustained discussion appearing between pages 40 and 55. Frank presents Hegel as an especially complex figure for the apophatic tradition. Evidence of this comes by way of of Frank's multiple insights about whether Hegel contributes in a positive way to apophasis or stands primarily outside of this tradition as a philosopher of totality, systematization, and rationality. I believe that there are basically two readings of Hegel in Frank's analysis. On the one hand,
Hegel symbolizes the antithesis of apophatic thought. He is the philosopher of the articulated whole, for whom everything can and must be said. But Frank also anticipates a number of ways in which Hegel contributes positively to apophatic discourse. Hegel's inclusion of the irrational in the rational exposes new directions for post-Hegelian apophatic philosophy. There is certainly ample textual evidence for this first reading of Hegel as the quintessentially anti-apophatic thinker of totality. Support comes especially from Hegel's discussions of religion, where God appears as immanently infinite in this actual world, as well as from some of his discussions about history and aesthetics, where he invokes the language of a completable end as the exhaustion of determinate being in history and art. But I believe some of the catchphrases that have helped to fuel postmodern rejections of Hegel, phrases such as, quote, "the true is the whole," end quote, or, quote, "what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational," end quote, or, quote, "the identity of identity and non-identity," end quote, have covered over some of what is important about Hegel's relentless preoccupation with negativity, irrationality, and contradiction. In this talk, I want to de-emphasize this first reading of Hegel, and I want to emphasize this second reading that aims to explore certain positive contributions of totality and dialectics for apophatic discourse. My primary objection to interpreting Hegel as a philosopher of the articulated whole who cannot thereby think apophasis is that the exclusionary consequence of this reading makes Hegel into an ultimately one-sided and undialectical thinker. If Hegel cannot think apophatic alterity in a genuine sense, that is, if that which is ineffable remains stubbornly outside of Hegel's system, this places Hegel on one side of a continuum and apophatic nothingness on the other side. But I maintain that there are good reasons to believe that Hegel is a thoroughly dialectical thinker, and that the consequence of this, far from being a rejection of the apophatic, is the total inclusion by way of the negative and the contradictory, even of that which radically escapes all articulation within the Hegelian system. We end up with a significant paradox. Hegel's articulated whole requires a genuine moment of the apophatic. Otherwise, what is left unsaid, the apophatic, would leave Hegel with a system short of total articulation. Furthermore, I maintain that this inclusion of an apophatic moment in Hegel's totality cannot only be the subsumption of alterity for a greater comprehension of rationality and identity thinking. Anything short of pure, radical, transcendent alterity would turn totality for Hegel into a fragment of the whole. Anything short of genuine, irreconcilable silence would depotentiate Hegel from saying everything that can be said. To highlight some of what is important in Hegel for apophatic discourse, I will briefly present three arguments from Hegel's corpus that each in their own way expose totality, not as the exhaustion of all positive contents of determinate being, what I call the bad finite, but as the coincidence of the negative. The first argument, from the preface of the Phenomenology, presents a case for why the true must include the false. Namely, because if it excludes the false, it remains one-sided and therefore of itself false. The second argument, from the moments of reflection in the logic, upholds contradiction as a more primary category than identity. I believe that contradiction for Hegel is intimately related to totality and holism. in the sense that it is the contradiction of something as its opposite that exposes every possibility of its being as one totality. And the third argument from Hegel's theory of modality in the logic anticipates why absolute necessity has contingency as a further consequence. This dialectic between necessity and contingency explains the modality behind the claim everything can and must be said in Hegel. Each of these arguments supports the thesis that there is really a paradox about the apophatic at work in Hegel's insights about truth and totality. Okay, so the rest of the paper will outline these three arguments in terms of what I've said. So the first argument, Hegel on the true and the false. In the second paragraph of the preface to the Phenomenology, Hegel distinguishes between two kinds of truth. One kind of truth stands against the false and excludes it from what is true. But this kind, Hegel claims, is dogmatic and one-sided. The other kind of truth is the truth of the true and the false together. This one is dialectical. Hegel writes, quote, "The more conventional opinion gets fixated on the antithesis of truth and falsity, the more it tends to expect a given philosophical system to be either accepted or contradicted, and hence it finds only acceptance or rejection. It does not comprehend the diversity of philosophical systems as the progressive unfolding of truth, but rather sees in it simple disagreements," end quote. Hegel admits that this first kind of truth has its place. It is true, Hegel writes, that Caesar was born on a certain day and that there are only so many feet to a stadium. It would make no sense if the opposite of these matter-of-fact truths were included as part of what makes them true. But philosophical truths work differently. They are not fixed or static, but rather dynamic and diverse. If we exclude the false from the true, we turn what we hold to be true into something that is false, because we limit ourselves to a one-sided position and do not reflect upon its interdependence with that which we deem false. What is really true, Hegel goes on to claim, is that the true is only true insofar as it is also false. This second kind of truth is the articulated whole between the true and the false. This expanded version of truth forms a dialectic between the two categories, true and false. Although the true and the false seem to be opposites, each actually transitions into the other as its other. The true becomes the false insofar as it is only the true. The false becomes the true insofar as it generates a multi-sided dialectic from the negation of what is only true. In this way, Hegel expands rationality to include the false in the true. The false, the irrational, what might in other terms be alluded to as the apophatic, exponentially expands the sphere of rationality and knowledge. By expanding the true to include the false, Hegel significantly revises what it means to be true, to such an extent, I believe, that truth and rationality no longer resemble their common sense counterparts, which define themselves at the exclusion of their opposites. That Hegel still calls this radical dialectical inclusion a kind of truth, and that it is still rationality, after all, that becomes expanded to include the irrational, might lead us to the conclusion that the false is only a means along the way to a greater comprehension of truth. Hegel often does seem to have this ulterior agenda to subsume negation under a greater synthesis of identity. Right, so this is definitely similar terrain, I think, to what you were talking about. But I think we miss some of what is important about negativity and contradiction if this is our final conclusion about Hegel. The following two arguments on the priority of contradiction and the consequence from necessity to contingency attempt to support the claim that in its expanded form, rationality no longer resembles its dogmatic counterpart, to the extent that it is misleading of Hegel to have called the expansion that includes the irrational a kind of rationality at all. Okay, so the second argument, Hegel on the primacy of contradiction. In a revealing remark on contradiction in the logic, Hegel claims that if we could separate our thoughts about contradiction from identity, contradiction would appear as the more profound category. As against contradiction, Hegel writes, quote, identity is merely the determination of the simple immediate, of dead being, but contradiction is the root of all movement and vitality. It is only insofar as something has a contradiction within it that it moves, has an urge and activity, end quote. This statement calls into question one of the most basic axioms of common sense rationality, that things simply are what they are, or propositions, and simply are not what they are not. That the laws of identity and non-contradiction are the indisputable foundation for the individuation of all things. Whether Hegel actually endorses a productive conception of contradiction is certainly a live debate in Hegel scholarship. One popular criticism of Hegel is that he conflates the most elementary logical distinctions, and from this commits egregious fallacies of critical thinking. In response to this, a number of prominent Hegel commentators have come to his defense. Robert Brandom, for one, can be interpreted to endorse productive contradiction as a kind of elaborate first principle of reductio ad absurdum. Stephen Holgate's work on the opening of Hegel's logic presents a case in a different sense from Brandom for why the starting point of the logic is so presuppositionlessly rigorous that one cannot even assume the law of non-contradiction from the outset. Susan Hahn offers yet another promising direction for interpretations of contradiction as productive in her work Contradiction in Motion, which explores how life and vitality for Hegel express the real existence of contradiction. I think that Hegel's preoccupation with contradiction is intimately related to his work on totality. It is by way of contradiction that one comes to satisfy the pressure to become complete. The sign of contradiction is the sign of exhaustion. Nothing remains outside of the logic of a contradiction. For common sense identity thinking, the reason why a contradiction is bad is because it says too much. Identity wants to exclude the opposite of itself so that it is, and its other is not. But contradiction places everything together and articulates everything at once. What arises with a contradiction is the totality of everything that can be said from one disposition. Contradiction is, in this sense, more primary than identity because it articulates the totality of form, that A is both A and not A. Contradiction, therefore, exhausts the formal positions of individuation. This exhaustion, however, is not static or dead being. On the contrary, contradiction interrupts the fixation of identity by exposing what it is to its opposite. This interruption of identity is at the same time the totality of identity, since there is no possibility outside of the form that contradiction exhibits for identity. Okay, so now the third argument. This brings us to the third argument. Hegel on absolute necessity and contingency. There is, in effect, a modal theory underlying the thesis that Hegel has articulated the whole. This appears in Hegel's claims about absolute necessity in the actuality chapter of the Logic. Against the conventional conception of necessity as the exclusion of alternative possibilities in actuality, Hegel defines absolute necessity as the total inclusion of all possibilities whatsoever, which in effect make things impossible to be